Good evening. So I am standing between a group of excited students and a volleyball tournament. So pray for me. As Brother CJ said, I am a software developer. I'm also a pastor in an ADC church, Anabaptist Disciples of Christ. Maybe some of you are familiar with that group. And so I've had the opportunity over the years to kind of see technology see the issue of technology from the technical side and also from the human side, because it does have two elements. I've posted my email address up there, by the way. If any of you have any questions afterward or you want to share any comments with me, feel free to do that. Just don't spam me. We'd like to start by discussing the idea of technology in general, and then kind of segue into social media in particular. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I have been, as Brother CJ said, a software developer for a number of years. I went to college back in the dark ages, many, many years ago, when we worked on a VAX 11 780. And now here today we are, working with cloud services and all the wonderful things that the more modern era has brought. And technology has shifted and changed and will continue to do so in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about what my view is of technology. And I don't mean to cram this down your throat at all. You have to decide what your vision is. But I'd like to talk about the fact that when new technologies come on the scene, there are generally those early adapters and those people who are really enthused about it. And then you have those other people who are a little more reluctant about it. And so there's always this tension between the adapters and I don't know, I'm not sure what to call the people who don't adapt, but there's always kind of a tension between them. And anytime there's a conference like this, there are always those people who light up. I can just see them. I love technology. Then there are those people who get kind of glassed over, because technology is something they have to put up with on a daily basis, perhaps, but they don't really like it. So we're going to start out with just a little bit of humor. I'm going to show you a video that was taken a long time ago. This is a video of a monastery in 15th century Holland. And there's a monk in the monastery, and he's been introduced to a new technology called a book. Now, this monk, who is accustomed to working with scrolls, has a technical problem with the book. So he calls for technical service, and here comes the technician and helps him, and let's see what happens.
Broder Ansgar?
Ja.
Det er deg, ja.
Ja.
Så bra, ok.
Ja, hei du.
Nå fatter jeg det.
Hei du. Ja.
Ja, hva gjelder det?
Ja, det er denne her. Ja, vil du sitte?
Takk.
Ja.
Jaha.
Ja, så jeg har ikke fått gjort noen ting hele formiddag, ja.
Ok, nei, jeg beklager at det tar tid. Altså, skjønner vi holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha hjelp på en gang, vet du.
Ja.
Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller?
Nei, den bare ligger der.
Ok, har du forsøkt å åpne den?
Ja, åpne den, altså hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helpdesk, hadde jeg vel?
Nei, det er sant.
Nei. Vil du ha en kopp varmt vann?
Nei, da, det skal være fort gjort, det
Ja.
skal vi se. Du bare gjør der. Sånn.
Ja.
Da er du i gang.
Ja, altså så langt kom jeg også.
Ok.
Ikke sant? Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne, så jeg turte ikke å gå videre.
Åja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner at inni her så ligger det kanskje flere hundre sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre så tar du tak i et ark på den måten her, og så liksom blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der.
Jeg blar, altså.
Du blar, ja.
Men når jeg skal tilbake da?
Ja, da bare blar du tilbake igjen. Tar tak der, og så der. Så er du tilbake til den teksten du hadde i stad. Ikke noe
Ok, så den slutter der,
Ja.
og så fortsetter den der, ja. Ok, men når jeg skal avslutte for dagen, hva gjør jeg da?
Da bare slår du sammen permene
Ja?
på den måten der. Sånn. Da er den lukket, der ligger alt lagret inni der.
Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå,
Nei,
altså.
alt ligger lagret inni her nå.
Ja.
Da må du i tilfelle sette fyr på hele greia. Det er kanskje lite sannsynlig. Så.
Ja, ok. Nei, men for det er noe med det at liksom, når du har holdt på med skriftruller,
Ja.
så tar det litt grann tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk.
Ja.
Ja, det var TV-tid.
Det er greit.
Ja, men du, en til før du går. Jeg må bare gå gjennom en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner
Ja.
Sånn.
Ja, riktig.
Og så, hva du kalte det?
Blar.
Jeg blar,
Ja, bla videre.
blar frem og tilbake.
Ja.
Og når,
Teksten ligger der hele tiden.
ja. Og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den.
Ja, riktig.
Flott.
Fint det.
Kjempefint.
Ja, flott det.
Ja, men du, vent, ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpnet den.
Ja, du har feil side. Du må åpne fra andre siden.
Så det er ikke likegyldig, det,
Du
altså?
må åpne fra den siden der. Sånn. Der. Der er den åpen.
Ja vel.
Har du
Ok.
lest manualen, eller?
Manualen?
Det skal følge med som manualen som brukerveiledning. Det er sikkert den der. Der, vet du.
Å ja,
Inni
den,
der
ja.
står alt sammen.
Ja, men jeg tror det er noe samme problemet. Får den ikke opp. Åpnet den.
Ok, det skulle vi kanskje ha tenkt på.
All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I did. The first time I saw it a number of years ago, and it just really drove home to me the point that that's kind of how it is when you're in technical service, when you work with people who are not accustomed to technology, and they, on the other hand, are frustrated with those IT people who don't seem to understand them and their human problems. So it's kind of the way it is, adopters and those who don't. Now let's think of the fact that technology, I believe, is a gift from God. Now that may shock you. There are some people who believe that technology is an evil, a necessary evil that we kind of have to, tread around carefully. Well, I understand that feeling because there is the tremendous capability of wrongdoing, and technology can amplify that. But I believe technology is a gift that comes from God, and I'd like to read a passage of Scripture from Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 to 31. I'm going to read this from the King James Version. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. I'd like to look at especially verses 29 and 30 for just a bit, and notice that God told man that he gave him all of these things, these resources. He gave him the earth, and he gave him a mandate. He said, subdue the earth. Take these resources that I have given you and use them and multiply and fill the earth and establish the human race across the earth. So I believe that God gave humans a mission. He gave them the means to fulfill that mission, and he gave them the motivation to fulfill that mission. And hence was born the idea of the creation of technology. How long do you think Adam worked in his field before he began scratching his head saying, there's got to be a better way than this? And so he created a tool, and then another tool, and the advent of technology began. Technology is the application of physical principle. Who is the creator of physical principle? God is, right? God gave us a world that is orderly. It's a world that is predictable. When you do certain things in a certain fashion, you get predictable results. Now, what if that hadn't been the case? What if if the principles that govern this world were unpredictable and changeable? It'd be pretty tough, wouldn't it? But they're not. They're very predictable. It is the application of discovered truth. It is not wholly a creation of man. When I was in college many years ago, I had an interesting comment that was made one day by one of the professors there. He was actually a professor of history, and he said that he was an atheist. And he was talking about, I think the class was about what the beginnings of Western civilization, and it went from like 500 BC to 1500 AD. And he talked about Christianity and the advent of Christianity across the world. And he said, I don't like Christianity. But he said, I have to be honest about one thing. He said, without Christianity, we would never have entered the modern era. He said that Christianity set people free from superstitions that kept them from learning and being productive. And it also made them believe that the world was given to them by God and was to be subdued. Isn't that interesting? Hearing that come from an atheistic professor. And I believe that is true. As Christians, we understand that the world that God gives us comes from Him as a gift, and He also gives us the means to take care of that world. I want to talk about a few things that have come from nature in terms of technology. Did you know that robotic arms, as we know them, the first robotic arm was inspired by the movement of an elephant's trunk? We also have injection needles that were inspired by the mosquito's little needle that he sticks into us. There are actually measures that the mosquito takes, including the fact that the needle vibrates a bit, to make it so that it isn't painful when he sticks the needle into us, because if it hurts, we go swat, right? So the mosquito tries to be careful not to alert us to the fact that he's sticking us. And so they've actually made needles that were based on that technology, and it makes them much less painful to inject. Swarm technology, we've all heard of drone swarms, right? The idea of bee colonies. Turbine blades were inspired from humpback whale fins and the way they're designed and shaped. There were bio-inspired robotic legs. Have you ever seen some of these robots that run on four legs like a dog? And the way they balance themselves comes from the way animals do it. They have simply borrowed from God's technology. If you're interested in this, that website that I'm showing down below, www.aranca.com, talks a lot about biomimicry, and you'd probably find that interesting. Let's think about some examples of revolutionary applied technology. Have you ever heard of the term disruptive technology? How many of you have heard that term? What does that mean? Why do we say technology is disruptive? Any thoughts? Well, what happens when a new technology comes on the scene? It disrupts the way we do work, doesn't it? It disrupts our everyday lives. Have you ever been asked to use a new tool? Maybe there are some of you who work with software, and all of a sudden there's a new version of software that comes out, or a brand new piece of software, and all of a sudden you have to change the way you do things. We talk about moving people's cheese. Those of us in the software industry talk about that a lot. Well, how much will this move somebody's cheese? And how mad will we make the user because we've moved their cheese? People don't like when you disrupt them, and yet disruptive technologies are very important. And the internal combustion engine was one example of that. Think of how it changed the world. The printing press. Think about what it did and how it changed the world. We have Johannes Gutenberg. You've heard of him, right? And movable type. You know, before that, if you wanted to do a page of type, you had to basically carve out the entire page and use that to press out the pages. So setting up for a new book was very difficult. Before that, we had scrolls and handwritten books and scrolls. Think about how much time that took. Suppose you had to buy a book that was made today by someone who wrote out that book by hand. What would it take to write an entire book? Probably a year. So you'd pay a year's wages for a book. But Johannes Gutenberg helped solve that whole problem by movable type, being able to take plates and put letters repeatedly and in patterns and setting up pages very quickly. And that made the Reformation possible, because from that came mass printing of the scriptures. And all of a sudden, as William Tyndale said, William Tyndale once made the comment, he said, I am going to make the plowboy in England more knowledgeable of the scriptures than the Pope himself. And in a very real way, he did that by introducing the English people to vernacular that they understood and were able to handle. So these are examples of disruptive technologies and technologies that change the world. What about communication satellites? Today you have these communication satellites that are out there 26,000 miles above the Earth in what's called a geosynchronous orbit, where they turn with the world and then you can bounce signals off those and then they retransmit them back to Earth. And so you can easily pass messages from one side of the world to the other. How many of you have heard of Starlink? Are you familiar with what Starlink is? That's low Earth orbit satellites, isn't it? They're talking about enveloping the entire globe with thousands of satellites. I think there's like 1,700 of them up there already. SpaceX is actually doing that project. And so those satellites, instead of being 26,000 miles away, will be 200 miles away. And what's good about that? Well, when a satellite is 26,000 miles away, when you send up the signal, it takes a quarter second of latency for the signal to be caught and retransmitted back down. So everything, have you ever talked to somebody who was talking on satellite connection and you get that echo and it creates a lot of difficulty? Well, these will be low Earth orbit. And you'll all know about Starlink in a few years because it'll probably be the way most of us get our internet service. It'll be a very less expensive and easier way to get internet service. Our world gets smaller because of technology. So when I wanted to come here, I live up in the northeastern corner of the state, about 4 hours from here by a car. I jumped in a car and drove down here. Suppose I'd had to bring a buggy. Do you think we would have had this technology conference down here? Probably not unless we planned for it weeks in advance. And of course, hopping on an airplane and flying across the world is something that is huge. It changes our lives. And those of us who live in the modern era often forget about what it was like hundreds of years ago when these things didn't exist. I have a son and daughter-in-law who live in Airdrie, Alberta. It's almost 2,000 miles from our house. And they have some little girls, 3 little girls. In fact, one of them was just born last week. But their second daughter, just after she was born, COVID hit. And so she couldn't get a passport, and they couldn't leave Canada, and we couldn't go to Canada because the borders were closed. And so this little girl, little Ruthie, was 17 months old before we saw her for the first time. Now, when I first saw her, she actually looked at me and smiled and was kind of tentative, but she kind of knew me. Can you guess how? Of course, by video communication. We talked back and forth a couple of times a week. And so when she first saw me, she was kind of like, "Oh, I think I know you. Yeah, you're that guy, you're that flat guy that lives in that box. How did you get out anyway?" And so, within an hour, she was sitting on my knee and I was telling her stories, and I could tell that all that communication by video had made a big difference. Now, some of you probably have family who are far away. Do you do the same thing? I'm sure you do. So that's a gift from God. Would you agree? What would we do without that? And when you look at technology and the people who create disruptive technologies, there's something in them that motivates and drives them to do it. Sometimes some of them don't sleep very much, they don't eat very much, and they smell because they're focused so intently on one thing. And I think it's God who allows that. He has planted that in the human mind in order for us to receive some of His blessings. Our work becomes less grueling and more automatic. We have a wood burner at home, an outside wood burner, and it eats lots of wood. What would I do without my chainsaw? What if I had to cut all that wood with an axe? And no matter what your line of work, you use modern technology that revolutionizes the way you do that work. Have you ever thanked God for that technology? It's pretty easy to forget to do that, isn't it? And just kind of take it for granted because that's all we've ever known. But what would happen if we were pushed back into an era when we didn't have those things? We would be in for a shock and a rude awakening, wouldn't we? Quality and length of life. It's interesting that in 1911, there were 135 deaths per 1,000 live births. And what that means is these children who were born in 1911, about 13.5% of them did not make it to their first birthday. That's pretty significant, especially when you consider the size of families in 1911. Most families were large enough that this meant there was at least one death in their home for a child who wasn't a year old. In 1999, that had dropped to 6.7 deaths per live birth. A huge difference. That makes a significant difference in our lives, doesn't it? Many of us have not lost a sibling or a child because God has given us modern medical technology. You know, sometimes there are times when, in terms of medical changes, in terms of sickness, we ask God to heal someone, and sometimes He miraculously heals them. And something happens that's inexplicable, and they just get well. And we praise God for that, don't we? But what happens when a surgeon operates on someone, or we give them medications and they get well? Is that any less of a gift from God? Not really, because He's the one who gave us the orderly world and the understanding of that world that makes that medical technology possible. The average lifespan in 1911 was about 47. Now that number was skewed a lot by that 13.5% of deaths before age 1. So that doesn't mean that the average adult who died at 47. It was older than that, probably more like 60. But when you were in your 60s, you were considered pretty old. Today, we live much longer than that. In 1990, that average age of death was 76. Also, when we think of feeding the world. I remember when I was just a young man in grade school in the 1960s. I'm kind of tipping my hand here, showing you how ancient I am. But when I was a young man in grade school, I remember being told by our teachers that by the year 2000, the world would contain over 6 billion people and there would be mass starvation because we would have no means of feeding that many people. Well, they were right about one thing, and that was that indeed the world did have over 6 billion people in it by the turn of the century. But we were better able to feed those people in 2000 than we could feed the people in 1965. Why? Because of modern technology. A gift from God, I believe. Science also, and technology also, bears witness to the accuracy of the Bible and the greatness of God. Did you know that we are located in a particular spot in the Milky Way where star density is not nearly as great as it is in other places in that galaxy? There are some places in the Milky Way where the star density is so great that if the Earth were located there, you could read a book by starlight. But what would that do? It would hinder your ability to peer into space, right? Too many lights. We are in a location where we can probe into deep space more easily and readily, and we can see the wonders of God's creation. It's almost like He put us in that particular spot and said, here, I'll turn the lights out for you. Take a look at what I've done. The naked eye can see roughly 3,000 stars on a very clear night in a very dark area. And there was a scientist, a Greek scientist, who confidently declared that he knew how many stars there were, just over 3,000. He knew he had counted them himself. Well, the Bible tells us that, talking about the stars, the host of heaven, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered, he says in Jeremiah 33:22a. And then again in Hebrews 11:12. Therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead, speaking of Abraham, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Now, if there were only 3,000 stars, that wouldn't be a very good comparison, would it? I mean, look at all the sand. You know, you walk along the seashore and look at the millions and billions and trillions of grains of sand stacked up against a measly 3,000 stars. I don't get the point. Well, today, based on the stars that we can see and based on the star density that we can see, the last report I read said that scientists now estimate that there are at least 300 sextillion stars in the visible part of the universe. Now, if you're like I am, you look at that number and you say, I have no idea what that means. That's a 3 followed by 23 zeros. What does that even mean? So I tried to break that down a bit to help me understand a little bit better what that number really means. So I'm going to start with the population of the earth. What is the population of the world? About 7 billion people? All right, suppose we take 7 billion people and we line them up and they walk by us at the rate of 1 per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How long do you think it would take for everyone to walk by? Any mathematicians here or people who like to guess? Now let's see, 1 billion seconds is what, about 30 years, right? A little over 30 years. So 7 billion people walking by at the rate of 1 per second, day and night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, would take about 221 years for the population of the earth to walk by you. Wow, that's a lot of people. Now, suppose God said, now, I have all these stars, and I'm going to give them to all the people that I created. So I'm going to take all the stars that I have, and I'm going to give them to every living person. And I'm going to divide them up equally. And so when he did that, one of you would say, well, I'm going to count my stars. I've never owned a star before, so I'm going to go out and count them. And say Brother Allen would be out counting his share of the stars. And his wife would say, Alan, when are you going to come into bed? And he'd say, well, just as soon as I finish counting my stars. How many do you think Alan would make it to bed that night? Nope. How long do you think it would take? Or would you believe that when Alan finally staggered into the bedroom 1.4 million years later, he would be finished counting his stars? You believe that? Or do you think I just made that up? I'll show you the math if you want to see it. It's incredible when I think about the vast number of stars that God has created, each of them so large. Some of them there are stars that are so large that they would encompass the entire solar system if they were in the place where the sun is. It's incredible. Others are smaller. But God made all of them. And it says that He calls them by name. He knows about all of them. And when you look at that number, you begin to understand that scripture in Hebrews a lot better. I see so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Wow. We serve a great God. And because of the technology that He has given us, we can understand better His greatness. Now, technology is often abused, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm not encouraging you here to just throw yourself into the world of technology and see what you can find and run with it. Because there are things that we need to do when we're interacting with technology, because technology is also used by the evil one, mightily used, to pull people into seduction and sin. And we'll talk about some of the ways that we can especially in regard to social media. There are things that we can do that will help us safely use the technology of social media and benefit from it and not be destroyed by it, and yet remember that it can be used for good or evil. Here's another way that modern technology has helped us see the greatness of God. So you all know about the theory of evolution, right? That's been around for a long time. And for a long time, you know, when Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, he thought that cells in plants and animals were very simple structures. He thought there was very little to them. What he didn't realize is that they are very, very complex structures. And if you, there's a movie that I would recommend if you're interested in watching it. It's actually by Ben Stein, and I don't know how many of you know Ben Stein. He's really not active anymore, but he used to be a comedian, and he was not a Christian. He was Jewish, but he created this movie called Intelligence Not Allowed. And he talked about the fact that in scientific circles today, the whole idea of intelligent design is not up for discussion. And he opens the movie in kind of an interesting way. He shows these boys playing soccer in East Berlin, back in the days before communism kind of collapsed in Eastern Europe. And he shows these boys, and they're playing in Berlin they're in West Berlin. They're not in East Berlin. But they're near the wall that separated East and West Berlin. And so they have this soccer ball, and they're kicking it around, and one of the boys kicks the soccer ball, and it goes over the wall into East Berlin. And they all stand there, and they just stare, because as far as they're concerned, their soccer ball just went into a different universe. No way to retrieve it. Completely different world on the other side of that wall. And so he uses this because he says that in the world of science today, the idea is there that you are allowed to discuss, to your heart's content, the origin of the world and everything on it, as long as you assume that it occurred by evolution. But if you bring up the idea of intelligent design, you are immediately canceled, as we would say in today's language, I guess. You are not allowed, your grants disappear. You are shut out of certain institutions. You are not allowed to discuss that. And the whole point he's making is that that's not fair. We should discuss both sides of it. And there's some of those ideas about the theory of evolution, and it's being discussed, have come about because we can see life at the cellular level now. And we know how complex cells are. And we know that they are, some have described them, in that movie, they're described as more complex than a city. The moving parts and the interactions that occur are incredible. So Sir Frederick Hoyle was a famed English astronomer, professor, and the director of the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge. And he compares the probability of spontaneous life to lining up 1 times 10 to the 50th. Now here you have a 5 with 50 zeros behind it. Or I'm sorry, a 1 with 50 zeros behind it. Giving them each a scrambled Rubik's Cube and having them all solve the cube at the exact same moment. Would you put your money on that one? Nope. Same thing is true about life spontaneously springing up. And these things are known in the scientific circles today. God's wonderful design is beginning to be understood. Another way to put it, he said, is that it would be easier for a tornado to hit a junkyard and to throw up a bunch of debris, and by so doing to assemble a Boeing 747 in mid-flight. Dr. Michael Mihei, who's professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, said that molecular evolution is not based on scientific authority. There is no publication in the scientific literature, in prestigious journals, specialty journals, or books that describes how molecular evolution of any real complex biochemical system either did occur or even might have occurred. So the idea that evolutionary science is even science is being challenged more and more. And why? Because God gave us the technology to peer into the micro world as well as into the outer reaches of the universe. Isn't that amazing? That's a gift from God, I believe. What about using social media for the glory of God? You know, I like to say this to young people especially, but also to everyone. When you post on any sort of social media, consider your post permanent. You can't remove it, okay? So you can delete it, put it on Facebook or Instagram or wherever, you can delete it. But someone might have snatched a screenshot of it by then. Who knows where it went by then? And those things can come back to haunt you later on if you write something that is wrong. It's also a challenge today to be honest and speak the truth on social media, because some people will cancel you for that. If you say something that offends, then you're out of the game because you've been bad. So social media can and should be used, I believe, in a way that glorifies God. Now, sometimes people get into discussions on social media and they say things, and I think, you know, if you thought about that for 5 minutes, you probably would not have said it. But they go back and forth. So I'm challenging you when you use social media. Remember, God gave you that medium. Use it for His glory. So communicating with fellow believers across the world. You couldn't do that a number of years ago, could you? Not easily. I remember many years ago when the communists were still in power in Eastern Europe, and there was a ministry going on through Brother David Bontrager from the Goshen area. He would interact with people in Romania. And I remember that they would encourage us to call certain numbers. They would give us a number and say, call this number, because this will connect you to a household in Romania. And when the Romanian government sees all these calls coming from the Western world, they get nervous. And they say, they know about that person, better leave that person alone. And it actually resulted in less persecution. I remember doing that. And they couldn't speak our language and we couldn't speak theirs. But you could hear them and they could hear us. And we were fellow believers communicating in a very primitive sort of way compared to how you can do it today. Today you can get on social media and you can interact with people all over the world. You can reach the world from your living room. I challenge you that social media is a good way to witness to others about Jesus Christ. But God has to inspire your posts. Are your posts inspired? They're inspired by something, right? Sometimes it's by too much caffeine at 3 a.m. perhaps. But our posts need to be inspired by God. And I'm just challenging you to think about this, and myself to think about this. Because this social media as we know it today is a very rare opportunity. This is the first time in the world's history that we could so freely communicate with people from everywhere in the world. We even have translation software, right? So if you want to talk to somebody in another language, you can do that. You can post in English and it can get translated, and they can post in their language and it can translate back to English. So I want to talk a little bit about objections to social media and to technology in general. There are, as I mentioned way back when we saw that little humorous video, there are people sometimes who object to technology for interesting reasons. And I just want to throw this out, and I want to be honest about this and challenge all of us to be honest about it. One objection that is unsustainable is, I don't understand it, so it must be bad. Now, people don't say that, but that's what they think. You ever seen that attitude? It's like, I don't understand this, didn't do this when I was a kid, so I don't understand it, so I don't like it. And you have to be patient because you have to understand how we old people think. Okay, I mean, I understand that mindset much better than I once did because things come up and I don't understand it and I don't know how to guide my children in using it and it scares me, so I don't want to have anything to do with it. But that's an unsustainable objection. It will not hold the test of time. You're not going to be able to hold back a generation with that objection. And this has been, it's interesting in world history, in the history of technology, this has often happened. Medical anesthesia is a good example. It has nothing to do with social media, or at least not directly, but medical anesthesia is a good example of that. Did you know that at one time, if you went to the dentist to pull a tooth, God forbid, they would do it without anesthesia because they didn't have any many, many years ago? How would you like to have your tooth pulled without any Novocaine or whatever they use these days? In combat, when they fired musket balls, if you were unfortunate enough to be hit by one, it was often in the limbs. A lot of people were hit in the arms or legs. So there were a lot of amputations because if you were hit in the arm or the leg, the chances of developing a life-threatening infection were almost 100%. And so they would do amputations without anesthesia. I don't even want to think about that, do you? Do you know that's where the term biting the bullet came from? Because they would hold you down, they'd give you a soft lead bullet to bite on, and they'd cut off your limb. And the shock of that often killed people. Not everyone survived it. Fatality rate was high. Recovery was slow. And it was awful. Did you know that some doctors started using ether? Because they found that if they gave you controlled amounts of ether to inhale, you'd go off into la-la land for a while. And while you were there, they could pull your tooth or cut off your arm or whatever they needed to do. But there were people who objected to that because they didn't understand it. And they said it must be witchcraft. And some said that it circumvented God's curse because he said we had to have pain. And there were all kinds of objections to the point that I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was a dentist in the state of Ohio whose practice was being boycotted because he used ether. And he actually stood in the town square and said, I'll stop using ether. Just come back to my practice. He said, I'll let your children howl and scream and moan if that's what you want, and I'll stop using ether. Today we use medical anesthesia all the time, don't we? Far more advanced than ether. Another is that we've always done it this way. Why do you have to have a new way to do it? Well, that's an unsustainable objection. Why do you have to move my cheese? That's an unsustainable objection. There again, smallpox. Vaccinations are a good example. Did you know that smallpox killed 60 million people in Europe in the 19th century? 80% of infected people died, or infected children died. 30% of general fatality rate. That made COVID look pretty tame, didn't it? 30% of survivors were blinded. It was a horrible disease. And yet, people objected to vaccinations for smallpox for a long time before it was generally accepted. Today, smallpox has been eradicated. As far as we know, it doesn't exist in the world anymore. Okay, computers. It's interesting. I remember hearing this a number of years ago. They use magical powers, or they're inherently evil, or there's this 3-story computer in Brussels, Belgium that does this, that, or the other. You've probably heard some of those stories. And they're just, misinformation, speculation, innuendo, all those things. Those are also unsustainable objections. When you throw out those kinds of objections, you're not going to stop the advance of the technology because people aren't going to buy into it. But there are objective issues with social media. There are things we need to think about. There are spiritual concerns. Temptations to impurity are everywhere in cyber world, aren't they? They're all over the place. As well as exposure to evil ideas. They're there. There are physical concerns. Really? You could get physically hurt by using the internet? Yes, you could. Identity theft is rampant, not only in social media in general, but across the internet usage in general. Financial fraud and physical harm. How many times have you heard of a young person who was lured away from their protective environment and they disappeared? And they used social media to do that. So that is a real concern. And there are social concerns. Social skill development. There are social skills that we learn on an ongoing basis. Did you know that I read about this here some time ago? They actually had to train, there were hotel chains that trained people who worked behind the desk how to react appropriately when certain things were brought to their attention, because they were used to communicating so much by texting and interacting through physical media, social media of some sort, that they began to lose some of the basic social skills. So Mr. Jones would come to the table and or come to the desk and he would say, "There's a rat in my room." And the response was, "Oh, there's a rat in your room? Okay, well, let me get form number 333 and we'll move you to another room." No, that's not what he wants. He wants you to be horrified that there's a rat in his room. And so they actually talked about social reaction. We can lose some of that. We can lose some of those social skills. And time management. Losing track of all the time we spend online. And so, Lord willing, what we'd like to do tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon is spend a little bit of time just kind of focusing on some of those. What are some things we can do that will help us? You know, there was a time when I would have told you to lock down your phone so tightly that you could, barely maneuver through it. Well, using safeguards of that sort can play a part, but there's more. Really, a lot. I told you earlier that I see this from the technical side and the human side. And I've come to the conclusion that to a large degree, the best defenses against dangers in social media are not technical. They are spiritual. They really are. And we want to talk about that. What does that mean? It's easy to say that as a way of escaping all the criticism and moving on. But in fact, that's true. There are things that we need to consider spiritually. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about experiences that I've had and that I've come across where people have fallen and have struggled. And what were some of the things that they did that they could have avoided? I'm going to stop standing between you and your volleyball tournament. We're not quite at an hour, but we're close enough, I think. But on Sunday morning, the last message is more of a message than a talk like this. I don't use a slide. I talk about, the title is The Protection of the Father. And we really focus on what God has promised to do to protect us and what He expects us to do so that He can protect us. It's very important to think about those things. His word is relevant. Yes, it was written many, many years ago, but it is very, very relevant in the 21st century. And we'll talk about that and what He said in His word. Any questions in closing? Any comments? All right, if not, thank you for being a good audience. God bless you, and I hope you win.